Hi, I'm Christopher Perrin. Welcome to this first lecture on the Introduction to Classical Education series. As you've probably already heard if you've listened to my brief intro, we're recovering something really important that was almost lost, what we're calling, for lack of a better phrase, I think it's a good phrase, but for lack of a better phrase, classical education or classical Christian education. Classical education has been around for a long time. It has a storied history. It's deep and it's wide, and that makes it difficult to define. It's like defining democracy or trying to define for someone who knows nothing about Christianity what Christianity is or what the Christian church is. So we need to be patient with ourselves, take our time, but still seek clarity and accuracy and even brevity at times. Sometimes we're going to need a brief, clear, and accurate definition or description of what classical education is. And many of you who are being introduced to classical education, who are educators stepping into this tradition, who maybe didn't come from it, didn't have a classical education yourself, you're asking this question appropriately over and over again. Well, just what is classical education? And I think, to be honest, you'll continue to ask that question. In this series, I'm going to seek to try to clearly define for us what classical education is. To do that, we're going to take a number of approaches because there are a number of good and legitimate ways of defining something. And we should be careful if we're going to define something that is deep and wide and has multiple facets. There's a sense in which we'll want to describe the whole, but then there's a sense in which we want to look at the constituent parts, the component parts of that whole. And so we'll see that as we define classical education, we'll move from whole to part and back again from part to whole. That'll be one ongoing movement. And this first lecture will be no exception. I'm going to try to give you a clear description or definition, a simple one, a dictionary definition for what classical and classical Christian education can be. But I'm also going to be moving already to look at some of the constituent parts to show that there's some complexity that is embedded in the simplicity. In other words, if we give ourselves a summary definition, kind of a dictionary style definition, we know that beneath that dictionary definition is an encyclopedia article that can go deeper still. And so there are going to be levels of complexity and depth that we'll encounter as we try to define classical education. But we should start at the beginning, and we should start with some clarity, and perhaps we should start with the summary definitions. So we'll be doing that. Let's just take a moment to talk about this word definition, because we ought to define definition because it's going to be so important for what we're going to do in this series. In fact, the first 5 or 6 lectures are going to be about defining and describing just what classical education is. Look at these words. Definitive. From, of course, the word definition, but some cognate words or some synonyms would be definitive and definite. And then, of course, their antonyms, indefinite and infinite and infinity. Well, at the root of both of these, both collections of words, is this word fine, which comes from the Latin word finis, which means end, boundary line, boundary or limit. So what are the limits of something? That's what we're encountering when we seek to define something. You've heard of the fine arts. Why are the fine arts called the fine arts? Also related to the Latin word finis, end, line, boundary. It's because the fine arts are ends in of themselves. So they're not a means to something else. To study art or music is to study it for its own sake. And so the liberal arts themselves, we're going to discover, are also valuable in and of themselves and not for any other purpose that transcend them. So when we talk about defining something, we're talking about the limits, the lines, the boundary lines of something. I hope that we can come up with a definition for classical education that you would consider to be fine, a very fine, good definition. But we'll also see that there's not just a single definition for classical education. There can be multiple definitions for classical education depending on how we're looking at it at the time. Well, this is what we're going to be doing. We're going to be defining, describing, and then eventually defending classical education in this series. And then we'll end by discussing it. We'll take one lecture just to discuss it. I'm going to be encouraging those of you who are viewing this in groups to discuss what it is after having observed and participated in 6 or 7 lectures. And then I'm going to encourage you to discuss it on the online forums as well, associated with this course. And then we'll end by approaching classical education for its deployment, its development, and for deepening it. Here's the syllabus, if you will. First, we'll be answering the what question. What is classical education? You'll see there's 6 lectures dedicated to what it is. This one, where I'm answering that question as simply as I can, what is it? And then we'll look at keywords that help us to actually speak and talk about classical education. That's the second lecture. And then we'll do some comparison, because that's another way that we define things. We compare things. We'll look at models for classical education and the core or component elements of classical education. Both lectures 4 and 5 will involve some classification. And then during the 6th lecture, we'll be looking at the history of classical ed. It will be a very brief history. In 30 or 40 minutes, I'm going to describe, survey, trace the history of classical education going from the biblical tradition in the Old Testament through the Greeks and the Romans to the church age and to the secular or modern age. And then in lecture 7, we will defend classical education. Why do we hold to it in light of the alternatives that are available? And then the last 4 lectures will address the question of how. How do we actually implement classical education today? That's where we're going. I want to remind you to download some PDF resources. You'll see on the website there's two resources for you. First of all, my 45-page pamphlet, An Introduction to Classical Education. You can download the PDF of that. And an article called What is Classical Education that I think will also be helpful to you. So once again, to define something is to look at its limits. From the Latin de, meaning concerning, down from or about, and finis, which means boundary line, or end or limit. We could just define something by listing a lot of various synonyms for what classical education is. For example, it involves a lot of words that are prefaced with this prefix re, which in Latin means again. So we have recover. We could say that classical education involves recovering something, renewing something from the past. I like to talk about the renewal of classical education. Recuperate. It's a recuperation. It's a recreation. We're recreating. We're restoring. We're revolutionizing education. We're reforming education. We're reappropriating the classical tradition. We're rebuilding it. We're redeploying it. We're reviving it. We're resuscitating it. This is a figure of definition known as synomia, just listing a number of synonyms, or systrophy, which just lists a lot of component elements for what a thing is. That can be helpful. It can be maybe kind of inspiring, or it can shock us to attention to realize that all of these different component parts are a part of classical education. But we're going to need to move to something clear, an eventual statement like a dictionary definition, and that will be coming shortly. But still, to set this up a little bit, we can also define by just looking at the meaning of words. We're going to look at the word classical itself. Where did that word come from, and why is it so important? The lecture 2 will be about words, about the meaning of words, etymology, their origins, and their past use and current meaning. Analogy is a form of comparison where we could say that classical education is also like this. It's compared to this, and we'll be looking at various analogies in lecture 3. We can classify, and that's what we'll be doing in the lectures regarding modeling and the component parts. And then comparison, again, is something that we'll be doing when we defend classical education, because we'll be looking at what it was and is and should be, and what it is not as we compare it to progressive and modern classical education. Sometimes things become clear when we describe what they are not, and when we put things side by side. Sometimes we'll need to compare apples and oranges, and in one sense, the classical education model and the progressive model of education are something like apples and oranges. They're both fruit, they're both approaches to education, but they're different. And then we'll see that there's a place for actually looking at apples to apples, comparing different flavors, different expressions of classical education. When we look at the history of classical ed, we'll see that there have been some various flavors. There's been theme and variation. it turns out that there's a number of good, legitimate expressions of classical education that differ in some ways. We will classify. Sometimes, if we're taking fruit as our analogy here, there's lots of different kinds of fruit. We'll be looking at the various kinds of flavors of classical education. There's the taxonomy approach, listing the component parts of classical education, as I mentioned earlier. We'll be doing this as we seek to define classical education, but we're not going to do it all in this lecture. That'll be coming in subsequent lectures, those approaches. So how could we, therefore, you've been waiting for this part, how could we, therefore, simply define classical education, especially if we want to just get started? Imagine that you're speaking to someone new to classical education, just heard about it, and is a bit skeptical about what they heard, and they keep asking you this question. So tell me again, what's distinctive about classical education? What is it in your view? You'd be asking that question of yourself. I've been asking it for years. So have a lot of us who've been a part of this renewal over the last 20 years and doing a lot of reading. Well, there are some simple ways to answer that question. But then we just must realize from the very beginning that there are also more complex ways, additional ways of describing or defining classical education besides these simple ways. But here are some simple ways. We could say that classical education is the liberal arts and the great books. I think this is a pretty good definition. I credit my friend Martin Cawthron for using this phrase a lot. I just started to copy him. I think this is a very useful way to start a conversation when someone says, well, what is classical education? Well, it's the liberal arts and the great books. Obviously, that's a high view, summarized definition, but it leads to more questions. Well, what do you mean by the liberal arts? And what are the great books? What consists of the great books? Now at Starbucks, you're having a pretty good conversation. But it means you must know something about the great books, and you must know something about the liberal arts. What are the liberal arts? Why are they called liberal? Why are they called arts? Well, we'll get to that. Here's another kind of cheeky definition of classical education. This is from Henri Moreau, the French writer who wrote Education in Antiquity. It's not the development of a child, but the formation of an adult. What are we focusing on? Maturity. What the classical educators used to call perfection, not meaning flawless, but meaning full growth and development and maturity. What if we called classical education the transmission of the soul of society from one generation to another? Can you imagine saying that to a friend at Starbucks? I'm sure they'd have some questions for you. But it's approaching classical education from its cultural standpoint. It's kind of a cultural definition of classical education. It's taking the inheritance, the tradition that's been passed down to us, and successfully transmitting it, giving it, bequeathing it to the next generation. As Chesterton said in another place, it's telling the truth to the last baby born. Another kind of cheeky and fun definition. This particular definition obviously emphasizes transmission, raising up the next generation, but it also emphasizes something else. Do you see what it is? It's that word truth. Truth is actually highly valued in the classical tradition. Truth, goodness, and beauty, these three transcendentals described by Plato and, of course, adopted and affirmed by the church. Truth, goodness, and beauty are realities that can be known. Or we could say that classical education is a matter of teaching children to love the things that are lovely. This quote goes all the way back to Augustine and also has roots in Plato and Aristotle. Teaching children to love the things that are lovely. Now we're looking at classical education from the perspective of the cultivation of affections or loves. And that's another legitimate theme or perspective in classical education. Can you see how already we're looking at different facets of this gem? But you could start with a definition like this. How about the cultivation of the soul on truth, goodness, and beauty? This also has its roots in Plato, Aristotle, and Augustine, and this is a way that my friend Andrew Kern likes to describe classical education, at least as a version of how he likes to describe it. The cultivation of the soul, that classical education is focusing on a human being, a soul, and developing and growing and maturing that soul on truth, goodness, and beauty. And Andrew would add by means of the liberal arts and the four sciences. So, which one of these is correct? Which one of these is best? Which one would you choose? Well, of course, I'm asking you to I'm putting you in a kind of a false dilemma. You don't have to choose one. You can choose all of them. All of these are good responses to the question, what is classical education? Well, just to reiterate, your understanding of classical education is going to grow over time. If you're new to classical education, I'd like you to take a deep breath with me. It's going to be okay, but it's going to take some time. It's going to be like learning a new language. Imagine you're studying French or Spanish for the first time. It's going to take you a few years to get comfortable walking in these shoes. The good news is a number of things that you've already learned from your past education, even though it wasn't classical, had some classical components and remnants because it never completely disappeared in our society. Like a shipwreck, it broke apart, but the pieces have been floating around, and no doubt you have grabbed some of those pieces. And as we start to put this together again, you're going to realize, I knew that. In some ways, I'm already classical. I already shared that view. I already appreciated that idea. So you're not starting from zero, but it's still going to take some time to go through some levels and grow up into this thing called classical education. Put yourself on a 3 or 5 year plan. Don't view this as a short course in which you're going to get it all. It's going to involve some reading and discussion and some implementation over time. Let's turn to this word classical because it's so important. We're trying to introduce, after all, classical education. And when folks are introduced to classical education, they frequently stumble over this word because it has a number of different connotations. Think about the way we use the word classical today. There can be classical music, and if you're involved in this renewal, you either like classical music or you pretend to. But if you don't like it and you start listening to it, you find the right classical composer, eventually I believe you will like and even love it. There's classical music, good night. There's the classical languages of Greek and Latin. There's the classical period of studying the Greeks and the Romans. We talk about classy restaurants, and we even talk about classic rock and, of course, classic literature. The word classical can refer to a lot of different things, and people have different kinds of evaluations of classical, whether it's good, in between, good, bad, or in between. Well, let's just talk about the word classical, but first I think we should talk about soft drinks. Do you remember the Pepsi challenge? Some of you don't, but if you were around in the mid-'80s, you heard about the Pepsi challenge. This is when Pepsi had developed a new formula, and they tested it with a lot of different people in blindfold taste tests, and guess what? More people were preferring Pepsi in a blindfold taste test to Coca-Cola. Now, Coca-Cola was a dominant software brand around the world, and it had been since it was invented in 1886, right? It was just the dominant software brand. And Pepsi began to start crushing Coke with this reality that more people in a blindfold test would actually choose Pepsi over Coke. So what did Coke do? You can imagine the executives meeting quite nervously because they replicated the test in their own laboratory. They themselves took the Pepsi challenge and they discovered that Pepsi was right. More people were choosing Pepsi. Take a sip of Pepsi, a sip of Coke, more people would prefer Pepsi over Coke. So what did Coke do? They developed, of course, the new Coke. They created their own formula to match the Pepsi formula until it was beating Pepsi in their own laboratory tests. And they rolled out the new Coke. And then what happened? Well, you've either heard the story or you were around and you know. The Coke fans were quite upset. They began to march. They began to protest. Some 40,000 letters were written to the Coke executives. Protest songs were composed. People began to hoard cases of the old Coke in their basement so they could drink their favorite Coke on into the future. They loved their old Coke. They didn't want to change. Well, it turns out there's a flaw in the test. If you take a sip of one and a sip of the other, most people would prefer Pepsi because it was sweeter. But if you drank an entire can of Pepsi and an entire can of the old Coke, more people would prefer the old Coke. Once there was all the protests, and once it was discovered that if it was a can-to-can comparison, Coke was better, then what did Coca-Cola do? Well, because they had another big problem on their hands, they re-released the old Coke, and they called it what? Coca-Cola Classic. They called it Classical Coke. Why did they call it classic? Because something new had come along. And that's what we're doing. We're calling this kind of education classical because something new has come along. It's called progressive modern education. It started in the late 1890s, continued to grow through the early turn of the century until by the 30s, 40s, and 50s it had become the dominant, it had replaced classical education as the dominant approach. But what did we call classical education, say in the mid-1800s and before? Generally we called it education. The reason we call it classical now is because something new has come along. We'll be talking more about this word classical in the next lecture, but I thought we should at least establish that meaning of classical. It tends to describe something of enduring excellence that's been around for a while, and sometimes we use the word in contrast to something new that has come along. We'll be using some analogies, as I said. This is coming up in lecture 3. We're going to be classifying. We're going to be looking at analogies like the museum and others. Classical education in many ways is like a beautiful museum. We're going to see that there's some old analogies that have been used, like this 16th century woodcut that describes the Tower of Learning. In other words, analogies and comparisons have been used by classical educators for centuries, and we're going to be looking at some very deep and common and perennial analogies. We're going to classify. We're going to ask 4 critical questions as we classify. This is coming up in one of the lectures, 3 or 4 lectures from now. We're going to look at classical education as a puzzle, pieces of the puzzle coming together. I think this will be helpful to you when we get there. We're going to compare it to the modern way of looking at education, and that'll help kind of put a classical education in I think a bright light for you. We're going to also just have to pay attention as we define classical education to this whole part relationship. So there is this classical education thing. There is something called classical education, and we can summarize it as one thing, but it's got a number of parts. And it doesn't just have 3 parts, it has a lot of parts. And we can begin to pull out one part or another for the purpose of analysis, but all of these parts exist together in an integrated whole. They're a web, they're connected. Just like those of you in the Christian tradition know that we can talk about the Trinity in terms of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We can study the doctrine of the Holy Spirit for the purposes of analysis. We can separate our study, but the Holy Spirit is always, of course, integrated in a unity with the entire Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so much, and that's true of so many other things that we would study in this world. Well, let's get back to just giving a clear description or a clear definition of classical education. You've been waiting for this, and now is the time. Here is a dictionary-style definition for you. It is not the final word. It is not the definitive definition. It's not the only definition. It's not the only legitimate definition for what classical education or classical Christian education is. In fact, when anybody creates a dictionary, what do the dictionary producers and creators do? They get together, they discuss how a particular word is being used or a phrase. They do their research, and then they try to summarize it. We can do the same thing. We could submit this definition to Webster's, and maybe they would take it. But sometimes the dictionary you pick up is not going to give you a sufficient definition for something that you know a lot more about. At any rate, here is my dictionary-style definition. Let's see what you think of it. Classical Christian education is a traditional approach to education rooted in Western civilization and culture, developed by the church, grounded in piety and governed by theology, employing the historic curriculum and pedagogy of the 7 liberal arts in order to cultivate men and women characterized by wisdom, virtue, and eloquence. Now, if someone was at Starbucks and asked you, so what is classical education? You might not respond with that. It might be a little hard to memorize a definition of this length, but it's a single sentence, and it's accurate, and it contains a number of components that are all a part of what classical Christian education is. So it's comprehensive without being terribly lengthy. But notice I have underlined a number of these words because these words are important key terms. Unfortunately, a lot of us in this cultural moment don't know what these underlying terms actually mean. So we have to look up those words too. We need a dictionary definition for what traditional means. To some people, traditional just means old, kind of dusty, and irrelevant. But to others, traditional means something really valuable that's been created and cultivated by those who've preceded us, that is worth conserving and passing on to the next generation. Oh, how about the word curriculum? We're not even sure what that word means. We tend to think that means products that you buy, published materials that you buy for teaching mathematics or Latin, etc. But curriculum really means, primarily means, originally meant a course of studies, a race course originally, and then a course of studies that you take students through. It's not something you buy, it's something you teach. Pedagogy, what is that? What are the liberal arts? What does it really mean to cultivate a human being? And what is wisdom? What is virtue? Can you define virtue? Can our culture well define virtue today? We don't even know what these words mean anymore. So that makes this definition difficult already. It's using some key terms for which words of which we have forgotten or have become quite fuzzy. Well, we could begin to condense this. So if this is a fairly comprehensive, a single sentence definition, you might want something a little pithier. So why don't we condense it? And we can move to something like this. Classical Christian education is a traditional approach to education employing the historic curriculum and pedagogy of the 7 liberal arts in order to cultivate men and women characterized by wisdom, virtue, and eloquence. We've cut a few things out. But the more you summarize, the more you have to leave some things out. The more you talk about the whole, the less you can talk about the parts. And the more you talk about all the parts, the more you lose a sense of the whole. Such is reality. Well, let's abbreviate it even further. How about this? Classical Christian education is a traditional approach to education employing the 7 liberal arts in order to cultivate men and women characterized by wisdom, virtue, and eloquence. You might be able to memorize that. Now that's getting, your working memory might be able to keep that in your conscious mind. But let's abbreviate even further. Classical Christian education employs the 7 liberal arts and the great books. See, I've replaced the word curriculum now with the great books. Classical Christian education employs the 7 liberal arts and the great books in order to cultivate men and women characterized by wisdom, virtue, and eloquence. It's getting even pithier, but we're leaving some things out. And how about we just go to this? Classical Christian education employs the 7 liberal arts and the great books. Or, like my friend Martin Cawthorn, we could just say classical education is the liberal arts and the great books. We still have to talk about what the liberal arts are, and we will have to talk about the curriculum or the great books. But we could do that, I hope. We certainly will be able to by the end of this course. So we can always go deeper. And at this point, I just want to pause and make a plug for a couple other courses on classicalu.com. There is, first of all, the Liberal Arts Tradition course and its associated book. And there's a book which is a great survey of the philosophy and a bit of the history of classical Christian education. It's well worth taking that course after you've taken this one. And then there's Dr. David Diener's course on Plato, the great philosopher educator, which will acquaint you with the classical roots of education, particularly in the seminal writer and thinker Plato. So you can get a book for each of these courses, and in fact the course kind of follows these books. So as we move towards the end here, we'll still keep asking this question. We won't stop asking this question for quite a while. What is classical education? It could be a number of things to people: classical music, literature, languages, history, etc. We started with a dictionary definition, and then we kind of reduced it to just a simple phrase: classical education is the liberal arts and the great books. There's a number of ways we could have reduced it, but that's how I chose to do it. So as we've condensed it, now we could amplify it again. So we've looked at the whole, you might say, and even as we've been looking at the whole, we've been aware of the parts. But then we can start to amplify and look at the various parts. This is, by the way, a typical pedagogy used in the progymnasmata exercises, the ancient writing exercises, condensing, amplifying, back and forth. So we've condensed. Now let's amplify and look at some of the various ways we could go deeper or expand our sense of defining classical education. So, what is classical education? We could give a curricular definition for it. We could create a definition for someone who's asking about the curriculum. Okay, I'm interested in classical education. What is it that you teach? A curriculum question. Well, here's an example. It's a study of the 7 liberal arts. What are the 7 liberal arts? Now let's expand and actually describe them. Of grammar, logic, rhetoric, known as the trivium, the threefold way, and arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, the quadrivium, or the fourfold way. This would be a decent definition, a curricular definition of classical education. But it's leaving some things out. It's not talking about pedagogy, it's not talking about the soul, it's not talking about community, but it's a legitimate definition as long as we know that we're focused on curriculum. What if someone wants to know about pedagogy? How is it that you teach? What is your pedagogical approach? Well, here's a pedagogical definition. A study of the 7 liberal arts employing traditional teaching insights and methods such as singing, chanting, Socratic discussion, and debate passed down to us by past educators. A pedagogical definition. What about the soul? Because we saw earlier that one definition for classical education, a legitimate one, is the cultivation of the soul on truth, goodness, and beauty by means of the liberal arts. Well, how about this? It's the cultivation, classical education, is the cultivation of wisdom and virtue by nourishing the soul on truth, goodness, and beauty by means of the 7 liberal arts. Hat tip to Andrew Kern and Plato and Aristotle and Augustine. It's also an approach if we want to talk about the fact that classical education involves a community of people coming together, this idea of paideia, which we'll describe later. It's an approach to education, the communal definition, that seeks to create a community of learning characterized by academic rigor, I'd like to say academic vigor rather than rigor, warmth and delight, and involving vibrant interaction of teachers, parents, friends, and others, a relationship of love between teacher, student, parents, etc. We could go further. We could give a linguistic definition. Sometimes when people are asking about classical education, they're thinking about the classical languages. So you could say that classical education is a study of the Greek and Latin languages and their associated literature. Tracy Lee Simmons, in his book Climbing Parnassus, emphasizes this particular way of describing classical education. We could include culture here. Linguistic and cultural definition. It's a study of Greek and Latin languages and the history, literature, art, philosophy, and culture of Greek and Roman civilization. I was a classics minor at college, and this is kind of how I would have thought of classical education if you had asked me about it when I was, say, 21 years old. Oh, it's a study of Greek and Roman literature, language, history, etc. Well, that's an appropriate definition as long as we know what we're talking about, but it's only one part of the whole. We could also give its intellectual history definition. Classical education, the last one, is a study of the great ideas of Western civilization as contained in the classic great books produced by that civilization. A study of the best that has been thought or said, to quote Matthew Arnold. It's a kind of great books or intellectual history definition. Now, all of these particular definitions can be helpful, but now we're expanding and we're starting to talk about these various parts. We might begin to lose a sense of the whole, but we will be moving from the whole to the parts and the parts to the whole again and again as we think about this very important tradition of education, the classical model of education. In conclusion, classical Christian education is deep and wide, and it's going to take time to comprehend. I would encourage you to do this as an action step. Why not, at the end of this lecture, spend some time thinking about it, maybe reading some of those downloads that I've mentioned to you, and write your own kind of preliminary definition of what classical Christian education is, and discuss it with some of your colleagues. Maybe if you're taking this course as a group, share your different definitions, your own summary definitions, and discuss them. We define by noting limits and boundaries. We should note the whole. We should note the parts. We should note what it is and what it is not. That's going to come up again in Lecture 7 when we compare classical education to its alternatives, particularly progressive and modern education. And we should clearly understand our terms. We should know how the words are used and what the words mean. And that's going to be, therefore, the focus of the next lecture. Lecture 2 is going to be about recovering and using the classical terminology for classical education clearly, accurately, and with effectiveness. So I'll see you then for the next lecture when we learn how to talk about classical education with clarity and accuracy. See you then.